Hello there. This is a talk that I wanted to give about investigations of investigations, and it's really about looking at how things are investigated and why we're so interested in such things. Over the years, I must have watched literally hundreds of films, documentaries, or podcasts, or even reading books about murder investigations and about death in general. In just the last month, I must have consumed dozens, spending hours, days, weeks observing numerous investigations. But why? It could be viewed as a bad thing, a morbid curiosity, an obsession with death in general, and indeed murder in particular. A friend I mentioned this to said that it must be depressing and was really concerned about all the negative effects of viewing so much programs. But I would like to think that there are a variety of other reasons why one might view those things, and that it might not always be negative. They were concerned about the impact on me consuming so much of that kind of material. And indeed, an obsession with murder or death in general could be something concerning. Yet I don't feel disturbed in the sense that I don't feel that I'm against murder any more now than I was before watching these programs. In fact, if anything, I am more against murder now, having seen the terrible impact that it can have and does have on both the murderer and their family, and the victims and their family, the witnesses and the investigators, and also the wider impact on society as well. Sure, an obsession with death would be a pathological problem, and indeed it is. But just the opposite problem is just as concerning when we shy away from death itself, when we refuse to consider it, to meditate on it, to hear other people's stories about it and their experiences of it. Death in general is something we will all live through. We will all know other people that have died, and will all one day face death, whatever it means, ourselves. Something that will therefore affect all of us. It seems natural, therefore, to be interested in it. But I think it depends in what way we do that. I certainly don't like to celebrate death, or murder in particular, nor to glamorise it. Yet equally wrong it seems to be to view death as necessarily a negative thing, or to make it seem any worse than it really is. Whether we like it or dislike it, death, we all have to accept that it is a part of life. I mean to say by this, death of the body at least. But of the soul, one has uncertainty, but that our body will one day decompose seems inevitable. When I was younger, I did tend to view life as a good thing and death as a bad thing. But I have revised my views over the years, feeling that both life and death both have good and bad about them. Life comes with its joys, for sure, but also its sorrows, with its pleasures, but also its pains, its truths, but also its deceptions. Death, of course, is a bad thing, since it is an end to joy, to pleasure, and to truth. Times of peace that come to an end. Yet isn't death also good if it means that it is an end to one's sorrows, to pain, to deception, even war and abuse and arguments all one day come to an end, as all things surely come to pass. Whether relationships or jobs, illnesses, arguments, our time within this body, all things are limited in time. Yet we don't always know how long we have, and what's given to us will be taken away at some point. But what's taken may be given back. Given all this, it seems very natural to be curious, to investigate death in general, but I also say murder in particular. Why is it, though, so especially alluring, so fascinating? And I don't think that I'm alone in having this tendency to watch and to listen and to read about so many murder investigations and so many programs in general that involve death. There seems to be newspapers, magazines, books that are fueled by such stories, a massive amount, and likewise, both on TV and online, one finds regular programmes of murder investigations, but also programmes concerning death in general. There seem to be many reasons of why that might be. Due to its nature, murder and death indeed can infect anyone. Any of us could become a victim, or any of our families could. Or we could indeed become an accused, or any of our families could. So it's therefore in all of our interests to know about such risks, to take precautions. But it's also to learn about what makes a good investigation or a bad one, to help also protect ourselves, our families, but also the wider public, so that we can be aware when we need to be and when we're called to be involved in such investigations, either perhaps being involved directly in the investigation or as a witness to it, providing often essential evidence. The second reason that we might be interested by such things is the shock factor. It is perhaps a potential draw, no matter how many times you hear it. A good, truthful documentary will affect you on an emotional level. It can incite feelings of fear, sadness, anger, compassion, confusion, and a whole spectrum of different feelings that are invoked. And of course, it's very different watching it, and as an objective observer, we can still be drawn into it when we empathise with those involved, when we can imagine or place ourselves in their position. But how much more is that emotion such raw and so deep, and we feel it within our very souls, when it's actually a personal thing that either involves a member of our family, either perhaps accused, or accusing others, or witness to something that's very severe, like a murder, for example. Then we feel those emotions on a raw personal level. Of course, when it's something that affects us personally, it's a different kind of feeling to someone that we might know casually or as an acquaintance, or someone that is a stranger that we can still take time to care about and be concerned about, and still have some emotional connection due to the fact that they are at least human, and we can strive to empathise with others. The third reason I've looked at is the thrill of the hunt, as I like to call it. We all like some mysteries. Puzzle solving is something we all like to do. And indeed it encourages us to think, to use our brains, to be active mentally. It encourages us to try and use logic and deduction. We get an adrenaline rush when we perhaps crack a code, unravel a mystery. Yet, ironically, when this investigation involves us personally or people we know, then the mystery is not perhaps just simply exciting and intriguing. It can have, though, profound psychological effects on us, emotionally, leading to outbursts of anger, to chronic depression, due to frustrations. It can be an emotional roller coaster when we're invested personally in a particular case. When we are watching real-life documentaries, or talking about them, or even producing or directing or reenacting them, we have to remember that we are dealing with real life and real people, with real emotions, real crimes and real victims, with real physical and psychological consequences, therefore. And so, whilst it's understanding that there's an excitement in these things, and that mystery can be so alluring and have such an interest and curiosity about it, we also have to bear in mind that mysteries can be a great burden and a great hardship on when it's a thing that's actually a personal thing. One can feel taunted by it, in fact. If you really don't know something about a loved one, either you suspect them of being a victim of a serious crime, or perhaps you suspect them of committing something. It can be an awful weight to carry, and such a terrible hardship not knowing. But of course that could lure one on, wanting to know the answer, however hard that might be. Too often we can think of people, though, as characters, but we must remember that we also can sometimes be viewed as characters in other people's stories. If something significant happens to us, it could be reported about in a newspaper or shown on a television program or online perhaps. And then when other people are consuming and viewing that information, we then perhaps become characters in other people's stories. Whether those are truthful or deceptive portrayals of us, we have to consider when we are portraying other people, that we would want someone to try and be loyal to the facts as best as we can be, and to make others aware if we feel that we may ever be mistaken in things. Of course, when watching these investigations, it's so easy not to be emotionally invested and detached. Of course, we're not if we're not intimately connected to it. It's different when our concerns are personal. We all have some mysteries, though, in our own lives. Family secrets, perhaps, that we're uncertain of. People that we're acquainted with, but that we may have doubts about. Which brings me on to the next reason for the appeal of investigative journals and documentaries. In other people's experiences, we can relate to their struggles often from our own, but looking at it more objectively, we might relate to a victim or their family's search for their truth and justice. So sometimes we can feel really alone in our investigation. We may feel that we're carrying that burden all on our own. And yes, we are all in a unique position. But when we are looking at something that is quite similar to us, we will often be able to connect with people, and then that can be reassuring if we kind of see how they're coping with a similar struggle to our own. The next reason I've got here is an educational aid. We can often learn how investigators operate, gleaning useful tips on how to handle difficult situations, how to methodically search. We might even learn from the victim and their families how they've managed to cope with a situation practically and emotionally. And from watching murderers, we may learn possible warning signs or the clues to their crimes that they have unwittingly left behind. And indeed, if it gets to a position sometimes where they've confessed, we may learn about how that they've committed the crimes, the lengths they went to, how they were able to cover it up, and the various techniques that they used to do that. Indeed, we may also learn how they've coped resolving those issues, how they've been able to come to terms with their actions, how they've been able to try and move on from that, how they've been able to be honest about that, to perhaps recompense others, to repent of those things, and indeed whether they were able to move on, and how they were able to deal with the world in that sense. Of course, hopefully we're not learning how they were able to get away with it and various techniques that they used to do that. But of course, herein is a double-edged sword. If I was to show you or produce a video showing how to perform a very clever trick, you might teach others how to become aware of such trickery, helping them to guard against that themselves. Yet you might also be teaching others how to perform that trick on others, or those that didn't or haven't yet viewed that video. So of course, if I'm showing or demonstrating how somebody's gotten away with a crime, and the clever techniques that they may have used or employed to do that, then that could be perhaps viewed as a good and bad thing. I could be showing other people how to guard against those techniques, but then again, I could as well be teaching other people how to use those techniques against others. The next reason we might view such material is for social bonding. Documentaries about murder and death in general are mostly from the point of view of the investigators and or the victims. We want to associate with others who have the same beliefs as us, especially when it comes to respecting the importance and the sanctity of life, and perhaps even death itself. Yes, there is a much more general trend today also of having perhaps those accused and murderers as being the central point as well in some documentaries. And I'm a bit wary of doing that, to be honest with you, because those that want infamy, that could actually provide them a motive for wanting to commit a crime. And indeed, sadly, there's been many people that have cited that as a possible reason for committing many crimes, that they wanted to become notorious, that they wanted their 10 minutes of fame, that they wanted books written about them and documentaries centered about them. Well, you know, there are many good documentaries that may portray them, though they don't glamorize their crimes. And I would be wary about basing a whole documentary around someone and giving them that exposure, because it can, at least with some people, give them that incentive, that motive to want to commit a crime if they want that infamy. Though, of course, with most of us, the majority of us that are able to think rationally and to see the consequences of such actions, we would rather be anonymous and lack any kind of fame if it meant being famous for the wrong reasons. We would only want to be famous if we wanted it at all, for doing something that merited that, for helping out our fellow man, for striving and to making an effort to help out the world in a genuine way. The seventh reason that I've come up with in regard to how and why we might want to view such documentaries or programs in general is the fear factor. Naturally, we all are afraid of some things in life. Sinister things like murder, especially, happening to us or a loved one. So why would we feel compelled to watch such things, depending on the case? Why would we want to cause ourselves fear? I think it's because we tend to reason that it's better to face those fears and know something about the dangers, since those dangers will exist whether we look at them or not. But what we need to be sure of course, when we're looking at those things is whether they portray a realistic version of actual things that do go on in the world. There can be a danger that things may whitewash things or sanitize things. That is to say, they make things look better than they really are. But there's an equal and opposite danger, of course, of exaggerating the bad things in life and making things look worse than they are as well. So we need to be cautious whether we are viewing things, just how realistic they are, in fact. But we do want to strive to see that realism, because we know that really awful things can happen to us, to other people in life. And so we would want to be more aware of those things. But of course, fears, as I said, can be exaggerated or minimized too much. One would not want a sanitized media that does not reflect the world we live in. Horrendous things do happen, however awful. We want to know the truth. Yet if we only view horror stories, and this also can create a skewed, unbalanced version of life, well, we might be tempted to view all as only potential victims and perpetrators, rather than as being so much more than that as well, as being people that have relationships, of having hobbies, interests, beliefs, of having a multitude of different relations to others and the world. This obsession, of course, can happen within any genre, of course. If we only watched romantic programs, for example, we may have a tendency to view everyone in terms of romantic terms. Or if we only watched medical programs, we might be tempted to only view people as potential patients and doctors. And the last reason that I've come up with our tendency to watch so many programs about murder investigations, but also about investigations and deaths in general, is perhaps our desire for justice, that we feel in our heart that there is so much injustices within the world itself, that we want to right those wrongs, and we want to find different ways of doing that. We want to learn fair ways of investigating others. We want to learn how other victims have coped and what help that they may need, and where we can provide that, and what things that they have been able to do over the years that have found that they can get support emotionally, psychologically, but also physically too, and where we can help and adapt, and also what help that we can give to ourselves and our loved ones for the injustices that we may have been through, that we may have faced ourselves. But also not just the injustices that a victim may go through in terms of what's been done to them, but also those that are falsely accused of crimes, and looking at the judicial process generally. How do we go about accusing someone? How do we fairly go about interviewing someone? How do we reasonably get to the truth on someone? What are fair and unfair judicial processes? All great questions to ask and investigate, and great reasons for looking into those matters, I would say. And to be sure, these days, it does seem increasingly, with a huge amount more of media that's available to us. There's a lot of documentaries, there's television and radio, there are books, of course, and increasingly there are online journals and articles, newspapers. There are online programs, films, documentaries, and people, even with their own mobile phones today, that are making videos and uploading things and sending each other memes and messages and texting and telephoning. We have such a variety, therefore, of different medias available today. And so we need to be cautious, I suppose, in the type of media that we consume and how we assess that information that we're given, and what credibility we choose to give it, and on what basis we choose to believe something or not. There's such a tendency today towards trial by media, wherein we can view information that portrays different people in a different light. And so we need to be cautious, about applying fair standards, both as a producer, a director, but also as a consumer too of those medias. Because we ourselves would want to be given a fair trial, in whatever capacity that is. We would want to be asked questions fairly. We would want to have the right to respond to any questionings if we're being accused of something. And so we would choose and want that for ourselves. Why wouldn't we also choose that for other people too? And so I think it comes down to that golden principle to choose and treat other people as we would want to be ourselves. I think there are a lot of good reasons for looking at these kind of documentaries and media in general that can represent murder, but such essential things in our life as death. And I think we're bound to come into contact with such things. But I think we do need to be cautious how we view such things, in what manner, and what we choose to believe in, and why we choose to believe in that too.